I have always been a creature of routine. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, I would wake up, brew my coffee, and sit on my back porch overlooking the small pond behind my property. The quiet cul-de-sac of Oakwood Heights had been my home for nearly 7 years, and in that time I had cultivated a peaceful existence among neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. We were not the type of community where people gathered for barbecues or block parties, but we nodded politely when we collected our mail or walked our dogs. It was exactly the kind of suburban tranquility I had worked so hard to afford. That tranquility began to dissolve exactly 3 months after Karen Westfield was elected as our Homeowners Association president. Karen moved into the largest house in our development 2 years ago, a sprawling colonial with perfect landscaping and a 3-car garage that always housed her immaculate white Mercedes SUV. She had campaigned aggressively for the HOA presidency, promising to restore property values and maintain the prestigious character of our neighborhood. What none of us realized at the time was that Karen did not simply want to maintain standards. She wanted absolute control. It began with innocuous community-wide emails about proper garbage disposal and reminders about seasonal decorations. But within weeks, her messages became increasingly specific and targeted. Dear residents of 1472 Maple Drive, please be advised that your trash bins must be placed no more than 18 inches from the curb and must be removed within 4 hours of collection. Your continued noncompliance has been noted. That was my address. I had left my bins out overnight because I had been called into work for an emergency shift. When I returned home exhausted after a 14-hour day, there was a printed notice on my door with a $50 fine. I called the HOA office immediately. This is Richard Thomas from Maple Drive. I received a fine for my trash bins, but I was working an emergency shift at the hospital. Is there any way we can waive this fine given the circumstances? There was a pause on the line before Karen's voice responded with saccharine sweetness. Richard, rules exist for everyone, not just those with convenient schedules. The fine stands. I paid it, believing it would be the end of the matter. I was wrong. The following week, I received another notice about my grass being precisely half an inch taller than regulation. The week after that, my mailbox was deemed insufficiently reflective, according to Bylaw 7.3. Each infraction came with increasingly hefty fines. When I repainted my back fence the exact same color it had been for years, Karen personally appeared in my backyard with a color swatch booklet. That is weathered ivory. The approved color is antique eggshell, she declared, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. They are literally the same color, I responded, trying to maintain my composure. To the untrained eye, perhaps, but the difference affects property values. You have 48 hours to repaint. I stood my ground that day. The paint is already purchased and applied. I am not repainting an entire fence for a shade difference no one can detect. Karen's eyes narrowed and she smiled thinly. We all make choices, Richard, and choices have consequences. I did not know then how prophetic those words would be. The violations continued to pile up, each more absurd than the last. My hedges were trimmed in a non-standard pattern. The wreath on my front door was seasonally inappropriate. My garden hose was improperly stored. I began documenting everything, challenging the citations through the proper channels and refusing to pay the more outlandish fines. Then came the evening that changed everything. I had just settled onto my couch after another long hospital shift. The baseball game had just started, and I was looking forward to a rare evening of relaxation. Without warning, my television went black. The air conditioner sputtered to a stop. The refrigerator ceased its gentle hum. Every light in my house died simultaneously. At first, I assumed it was a neighborhood-wide outage. I peered through my blinds, expecting to see the entire street in darkness. Instead, I saw porch lights glowing, televisions flickering through windows, and every house illuminated except mine. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside to check the circuit breaker. Everything looked normal there. I walked to the electrical meter at the side of my house. That was when I noticed the clean, deliberate cuts in the power lines leading to my home. This was not an accident. This was not a power company error. Someone had intentionally cut my electricity. I stood there in stunned silence, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the severed cables. My hands shook slightly as I reached for my phone to call the power company. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty who was responsible, but I could never have imagined how far this conflict would escalate, or how dramatically it would change not just my life, but the entire neighborhood. "Sir, I can confirm this was not done by any of our technicians," the power company representative said after examining the damage the following morning. "These lines have been deliberately cut. I have to report this as vandalism." The technician looked uncomfortable as he wrote up his report. "Have you had any conflicts with neighbors recently? This kind of thing does not usually happen by accident." I thought about mentioning Karen, but without proof, it would be my word against hers. "Just general HOA issues," I said vaguely. "How long until I can get power restored?" "We will need to replace this entire section. Given the nature of the damage, there will be fees for the emergency service. I cannot guarantee restoration until tomorrow at the earliest." I nodded, resigned to at least 24 more hours without electricity. As the technician packed up his equipment, I noticed Karen walking her perfectly groomed Pomeranian past my house. She slowed deliberately, taking in the scene with exaggerated concern. "Electrical problems, Richard? How unfortunate. Perhaps you should have consulted the HOA before making unauthorized modifications to your exterior systems." My jaw tightened. Someone cut my power lines, Karen. This was vandalism. She raised her eyebrows in mock surprise. "Are you suggesting someone in our peaceful community would do such a thing? Perhaps it was your own negligence. Your home maintenance has been rather substandard lately." Before I could respond, she tugged her dog's leash and continued her walk, calling over her shoulder, "Be sure to file the proper permits for any electrical work. We would not want any more violations, would we?" I spent the day calling the police, who listened to my story with mild interest before informing me that without evidence or witnesses, there was little they could do. "It is a civil matter unless you have proof of who did it," the officer explained. "Best we can do is file a report for your insurance." By evening, I realized I needed a temporary solution. My refrigerator was filled with food that would soon spoil, and the summer heat made my house nearly uninhabitable. I called a friend who worked in construction, and by nightfall, he had delivered a generator to my driveway. The machine was old and loud, but it provided enough power to run the essentials. The generator had been running for less than an hour when my phone rang. It was Karen. "Richard, we have received multiple complaints about the excessive noise coming from your property. Generators are not approved equipment without prior HOA authorization." I struggled to control my temper. "My power was cut, Karen. I need electricity for basic necessities." "That does not exempt you from the rules. You have 1 hour to shut it down, or you will be fined $500 per day for noise violation and operation of unauthorized equipment." I hung up without responding and continued using the generator. The following morning, I found a notice taped to my front door with a fine for exactly that amount. By the time the power company arrived to restore my electricity, I had received 2 more violation notices for excessive lawn ornaments, the generator, and improper waste disposal, the empty gas cans. When I finally had power again, I called an emergency HOA board meeting to address the situation. Karen presided over the meeting with 5 other board members, all of whom seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge her. Mr. Thomas claims his power lines were vandalized, Karen announced to the board, but has provided no evidence of who might have done this. Now he wishes the association to waive his legitimate fines for subsequent violations. My subsequent violations only occurred because someone cut my power, I argued. And I find it suspicious that the same person who has been targeting me with petty fines for months is now denying any connection. Karen's face hardened. Are you accusing me of criminal activity, Mr. Thomas? That is a serious defamation risk. One of the board members, a timid man named Michael, attempted to mediate. Perhaps we could reduce the fines given the circumstances. Karen turned her glare on him. The bylaws are clear, exceptions create precedent, the fines stand. The vote was 5-1 in Karen's favor. As I left the meeting, I realized I was being systematically isolated. Karen had the board under her control, and she was using the full weight of the HOA to crush me. That night, I began documenting everything, taking photographs of each notice, recording dates and times of every interaction, and creating a timeline of events. If this was war, I needed ammunition. Later that week, I returned home to find yet another notice. This one was different. Dear resident, your property has been deemed a community eyesore due to improper maintenance and repeated violations. The HOA will be conducting a formal review of your standing in the community. The implied threat was clear. Karen was building a case to force me out. As I stood in my driveway, staring at the notice, I realized I could not fight this alone. I needed allies. I needed information. Most importantly, I needed to understand who else had suffered under Karen's reign. It was time to start asking questions. My first approach was casual. I began walking the neighborhood in the evenings, nodding to residents tending their gardens or checking their mail. Most responded with the same distant politeness that had always characterized our community. But when I mentioned the HOA or Karen specifically, I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor, averted eyes, lowered voices, nervous glances toward her house at the end of the street. Eleanor and Robert Hughes, an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood since its construction, were the first to open up. I had helped them clear their driveway after a heavy snowstorm last winter, and they had always been friendly. When I mentioned my HOA troubles, Eleanor looked around cautiously before inviting me inside. We have had our own problems with that woman, Robert said once we were seated in their immaculate living room. Last spring, Eleanor hung wind chimes that her granddaughter made, beautiful things not even very loud. Eleanor nodded sadly. Karen came by personally to tell us they were against regulation. When we asked which regulation, she cited noise pollution and unauthorized decorative elements. We were fined $300, Robert continued. On our fixed income, that was grocery money for the month. They showed me a folder with their own collection of violation notices, each more arbitrary than the last. Front door color, unauthorized bird feeder, excessive holiday lighting. The pattern was identical to what I had experienced. 2 days later, I met Marcus and Tara Johnson, a young couple with twin 5-year-old boys. They had installed a basketball hoop on their driveway, only to receive daily fines for recreational equipment visible from the street. "We almost lost our house," Tyra confided as her sons played quietly in the background. "The fines accumulated so quickly that we fell behind on our mortgage payments. We had to borrow money from my parents to avoid foreclosure." Marcus leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "We heard she did the same thing to the previous owners of your house, drove them out with fines and violations until they had no choice but to sell." That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Was I simply the latest target in a pattern of abuse? How many others had Karen forced out to maintain her vision of the perfect neighborhood? As I continued my quiet investigation, I met their teenage son, Jaden, a computer science prodigy who offered his assistance after overhearing our conversation. "I could help you set up some security cameras," he suggested. "Wireless, hard to detect, but high resolution enough to catch anything suspicious." Within days, Jaden had installed a discreet system around my property. The cameras were small, weatherproof, and connected to a secure cloud storage account that I could access from my phone. For the first time since the power line incident, I felt a measure of security. With each new conversation, the picture became clearer. Karen had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years, using the HOA as her personal weapon. Mr. Chen at the corner house had been fined for growing non-approved vegetation, traditional Chinese herbs his family had cultivated for generations. The Patels had received violations for cooking odors when they prepared traditional Indian meals. The Rodriguezes had been cited for having too many family members visiting on weekends. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came from David Miller, the former HOA treasurer who had resigned shortly after Karen took over. "She manipulates the books," he told me during a hushed conversation in the local coffee shop. "HOA fees disappear into administrative costs or community improvements that never materialize. When I questioned the discrepancies, she threatened to expose some personal information about my daughter's struggle with addiction." "Is that legal?" I asked, stunned by the implications. David shrugged helplessly. "Probably not, but who has the resources to audit an HOA? Most people just pay their dues and try to stay off her radar." Armed with this knowledge, I began digging deeper into the HOA bylaws and financial records, which were technically available to all residents but buried in bureaucratic language and procedural obstacles. What I found confirmed David's accusations: thousands of dollars unaccounted for, rules selectively enforced, and procedures blatantly ignored. Most damning of all was the revelation about Karen's presidency itself. According to the bylaws, HOA board elections required a community-wide vote with at least 60% participation. The records showed that Karen's election had only 25% participation, mostly from her closest allies in the neighborhood. She had simply declared herself president when the previous leader stepped down, bypassing the mandated voting process entirely. As word of my investigation spread through whispered conversations and private messages, I began to sense a shift in the community. People nodded to me more openly. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox with additional evidence of Karen's misconduct. Someone left a folder on my porch containing copies of HOA meeting minutes that had been officially lost. The neighborhood was waking up, finding its voice after years of intimidation. What had started as my personal battle was evolving into something larger, a community reclaiming its power. But as the resistance grew, so did Karen's awareness of it, and her retaliation would be swift and merciless. I knew Karen had discovered my investigation when the frequency and severity of violations against me suddenly tripled. In a single week, I received notices for improper window treatments. My blinds were partially open. Unauthorized gathering. I had spoken with the Johnsons on my front lawn. And violation of noise ordinance. My air conditioning unit was supposedly too loud. The most absurd citation came on a Tuesday morning, a fine for improper facial expressions in a common area. According to the notice, I had displayed hostile facial configurations toward an HOA official, which violated the community harmony provision. The fine was $1,000. Beyond the official notices, other forms of harassment began. My mailbox was filled with anonymous notes warning me to mind your own business and remember what happened to your power. My car was photographed daily, presumably looking for parking violations. Someone called my workplace falsely claiming I had been drinking on the job. The pressure was relentless. My performance at the hospital began to suffer as sleep deprivation and stress took their toll. My supervisor called me into her office after I made a minor charting error. "Richard, you have always been one of our most reliable staff members. Is everything all right at home?" I considered explaining the situation, but feared it would sound paranoid and trivial. Just some neighborhood disputes, nothing serious. "Well, whatever it is, please resolve it soon. We cannot afford mistakes in patient care." That weekend, I consulted with Angela Ramirez, a lawyer specializing in property disputes and HOA conflicts. She reviewed my documentation with growing concern. "What you are describing is a clear abuse of power," she explained. "HOAs have significant authority, but they are not above the law. The power line incident alone could constitute criminal vandalism and possibly reckless endangerment." "But I cannot prove she did it," I reminded her. "Not directly, perhaps, but we can establish a pattern of targeted harassment and procedural violations. The election irregularities are particularly concerning. According to these bylaws, Karen's presidency is technically invalid." Angela helped me draft a formal grievance challenging Karen's position and cataloging the numerous violations of HOA procedures. The document requested a special community meeting to address these issues, with all residents invited to participate. "You have the right to call this meeting under Section 8.3 of your bylaws," Angela explained. "If Karen refuses, that is another procedural violation we can add to the list." I filed the grievance the following day, delivering copies to each board member as required. Karen's response was immediate. She appeared at my door that evening, her face flushed with barely contained rage. "You have no idea what you are doing," she hissed. "This meeting will never happen, and even if it did, no one would support you. I have made this neighborhood what it is today." "The bylaws say I have the right to call this meeting," I replied calmly. "Are you refusing to comply with the association's own rules?" "Rules can be interpreted in many ways, Richard, just like power lines can mysteriously fail." The threat was barely veiled, but this time I was prepared. "That sounds remarkably like an admission, Karen. I would be careful what you say. It might be recorded." Her eyes darted to my porch light, where one of Jaden's cameras was discreetly mounted. She stepped back, recalculating. "The meeting is denied due to improper filing procedures. You will receive official notice tomorrow." True to her word, I received a formal rejection the next day citing obscure technicalities. But Karen had underestimated the changing mood of the neighborhood. When word spread that the meeting had been denied, residents began to mobilize. Michael, the timid board member who had suggested reducing my fines, contacted me privately. "She cannot just ignore the bylaws," he said with newfound determination. "3 board members can override the president's decision. I have spoken with Lisa and James. We are calling the meeting ourselves." Within hours, notices appeared throughout the neighborhood announcing a special HOA meeting to address community concerns and procedural reviews. It was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community center. Karen immediately sent out a competing notice canceling the meeting due to scheduling conflicts. The neighborhood response was unprecedented. Residents began replying directly to Karen's email, questioning her authority to cancel a board-approved meeting. Others posted supportive messages on the community bulletin board. The Johnsons organized a door-to-door campaign to ensure everyone knew about the meeting regardless of official notices. Karen's supporters fought back with their own campaign of intimidation. Cars drove slowly past my house at all hours. Someone left a dead plant on my doorstep with a note reading, "You are next." Board member Michael found his car tires deflated. The Johnsons' basketball hoop was vandalized. But the tide had turned. For every act of intimidation, 3 acts of solidarity emerged. When Michael's tires were flattened, 4 neighbors helped him replace them. When threatening notes appeared, twice as many supportive messages followed. The community that had once been fractured by fear was unifying in resistance. The night before the meeting, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Check your security footage from 2:03 a.m. last week." I reviewed the recordings and found what I had been waiting for: clear video of Karen approaching my electrical meter with wire cutters, deliberately severing the power lines, and walking away with a satisfied smile. The timestamp and image quality were perfect. As I watched the footage, a strange calm settled over me. Tomorrow would change everything. The spark of retaliation had ignited something unexpected, not just my personal vindication, but the resurrection of a community's voice. Karen had tried to silence me by cutting my power. Instead, she had only illuminated her own abuses for everyone to see. Saturday dawned clear and unnaturally quiet. As I walked to the community center, I noticed the absence of the usual weekend sounds. No lawnmowers, no children playing, no cars being washed in driveways. The entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. The community center was a modest building at the entrance to our development, typically used for yoga classes and book club meetings. Today, it was packed beyond capacity. Residents stood along the walls and spilled out onto the patio. I recognized faces I had never seen at HOA meetings before: the reclusive professor from Sycamore Lane, the night shift nurse from Elmwood Drive, even elderly Mr. Abernathy, who rarely left his home since his wife passed. Michael, Lisa, and James sat at the board table looking nervous but resolved. The 4th and 5th board members, longtime Karen allies, were conspicuously absent. Most surprising was Karen herself, seated in the center of the front row, immaculately dressed and wearing an expression of bored contempt. Michael called the meeting to order with a shaky voice that grew stronger with each word. "We have called this special session to address concerns regarding HOA procedures and leadership. Anyone wishing to speak will have 3 minutes." Karen immediately stood. "Before we waste everyone's Saturday with unfounded accusations, I move to dismiss this unauthorized meeting. The proper procedures for calling a special session were not followed." Lisa, a retired paralegal, responded firmly. "Section 8.3 of our bylaws states that 3 board members can call a special meeting with 48 hours' notice. That requirement has been met." Karen's dismissive laugh echoed through the room. This meeting was organized by disgruntled residents who refuse to comply with community standards. It has no legitimate purpose beyond character assassination. Michael cleared his throat. "We have a list of speakers. First is Richard Thomas." I walked to the front, my tablet and portable projector in hand. For a moment I looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, some curious, some hostile. Karen smiled mockingly, certain of her invincibility. "I moved to this neighborhood 7 years ago because it felt like a community," I began. "In recent months, that sense of community has been replaced by fear and intimidation. What I am about to show you is not about personal grievances or neighborhood aesthetics. It is about abuse of power and potentially criminal actions." I connected my tablet to the projector and displayed a timeline of the violations against me, alongside the relevant HOA bylaw sections showing how each citation was either grossly exaggerated or completely fabricated. Then I showed comparative photos of other properties with identical violations that received no citations. This selective enforcement is not just unfair, it is explicitly prohibited by our HOA charter, I explained. But more concerning is what happened when I began to challenge these practices. The room fell completely silent as I played the security footage of Karen cutting my power lines. The video was crystal clear, showing her face in detail as she deliberately severed the cables, looked directly at my darkened house, and smiled before walking away. Karen shot to her feet. "That video is clearly doctored. This is defamation. I will sue you for everything you have." "The footage has been authenticated by 2 independent security experts," I replied calmly. "Their signed affidavits are included in the packets being distributed now. Additionally, the power company's report confirmed that the lines were cut with precision tools, not damaged by weather or accident." Murmurs spread through the room as volunteers handed out detailed dossiers documenting Karen's systematic abuses. Even her supporters looked uncomfortable as they flipped through pages of evidence. "But this is not just about me," I continued. "Many of you have suffered similar treatment." One by one, neighbors began to stand and share their stories. Eleanor described how her cherished wind chimes had been declared contraband. The Johnsons recounted their near foreclosure over basketball hoop violations. Mr. Chen explained how he had been prohibited from growing his family's traditional herbs. With each testimony, Karen's face grew tighter, her interjections more desperate. "These people are all violating clear regulations. Property values would collapse without proper enforcement." The breaking point came when David Miller, the former treasurer, presented financial records showing approximately $87,000 in HOA funds allocated to administrative expenses without documentation or board approval. The documents revealed that during Karen's tenure, special assessment funds designated for playground improvements had instead been used for landscaping services exclusively on Karen Street, primarily around her own property. "This is not strict enforcement of rules," David concluded. "This is embezzlement and fraud." Karen's composure finally shattered. "You ungrateful people have no idea what I have sacrificed for this community. I have dedicated years to maintaining standards while you all tried to turn this neighborhood into a trailer park. Without me, your property values would be in the gutter." Her shouting only emphasized how thoroughly she had lost control. Michael called for order, then addressed the room with newfound authority. "According to our bylaws, An HOA president can be removed by a two-thirds majority vote of homeowners present at a properly called meeting. Given the severity of these allegations and the evidence presented, I move that we vote immediately on Karen Westfield's removal. The vote was not even close. Of the 112 households represented, 98 voted for Karen's immediate removal. Only 7 supported her, with 7 abstentions. As the results were announced, the room erupted in applause. Decades of accumulated fear and resentment released in a cathartic wave of clapping and cheers. Karen stood rigidly in the center of the celebration, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. "This is not over," she hissed as she gathered her belongings. "I have contracts, I have connections, I will destroy all of you." No one responded to her threats. No one tried to stop her as she stormed out of the community center. The neighborhood had found its voice, and there was no going back to the silence of fear. As the meeting concluded, people lingered, introducing themselves to neighbors they had been afraid to approach for years. Phone numbers were exchanged. Impromptu plans for a genuine community gathering were discussed. For the first time in recent memory, the neighborhood felt like a neighborhood again. But as I watched Karen's retreating figure through the window, I knew her final warning was not empty. This victory had exposed her, humiliated her, and threatened her control. She would not surrender quietly. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Precisely 3 days after the community meeting, a courier delivered a thick envelope to my door. Inside was a lawsuit nomming me as the primary defendant in a case of defamation, harassment, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Karen was suing me for $2.4 million. The complaint painted a very different picture of recent events. According to Karen's version, she was a dedicated community servant who had been systematically targeted by a conspiracy of disgruntled rule breakers, led by me. The power line incident was described as a fabricated accusation based on manipulated evidence. My investigations were characterized as stalking and intimidation tactics. I called Angela Ramirez immediately, forwarding the documents to her office. Her response was measured but concerned. "This is not unexpected, but the scale of the lawsuit is designed to intimidate. She has hired Bradford Collins, a notoriously aggressive litigator who specializes in dragging out proceedings to deplete the defendant's resources." "Can she actually win?" I asked, stomach churning at the astronomical figure in the complaint. "On merit? No. The evidence is overwhelmingly against her. But litigation is not just about merit. It is about endurance and resources. She is betting you cannot afford to defend yourself long enough to reach a verdict." She was right. My savings would barely cover the initial legal fees, let alone a protracted court battle. As word of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood, however, something remarkable happened. Michael called an emergency meeting of the new HOA board, which now included Lisa, James, Marcus Johnson, and Alina Hughes. "The HOA has legal defense funds for board members facing litigation related to their official duties," Michael explained. While Richard was not on the board, his actions directly benefited the association by exposing fraudulent activities. I propose we allocate funds for his defense. The vote was unanimous. Additionally, residents began organizing a separate legal defense fund, with contributions ranging from $20 to several thousand. Within a week, we had raised enough to retain Angela's firm for the duration of the case. Karen's response was to expand the lawsuit, adding the entire HOA board as co-defendants and increasing the damages sought to $5.8 million. Her legal team filed motion after motion, each requiring responses and court appearances. The process was clearly designed to exhaust us both financially and emotionally. The first major hearing took place 6 weeks after the initial filing. The courthouse was an imposing granite building in the county seat, its formal atmosphere intensifying the gravity of the proceedings. Karen arrived with a team of 3 attorneys, dressed as if attending a corporate board meeting. Our side consisted of Angela, her associate, and me, supported by dozens of neighbors who filled the public seating area. Judge Harriet Richardson, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench, reviewed the competing motions with evident impatience for Bradford Collins' theatrical objections. Your Honor, the defendants have engaged in a coordinated campaign to defame my client and destroy her reputation through manipulated evidence and coerced testimony, Collins declared. Ms. Westfield's exemplary service to her community has been rewarded with vicious character assassination. Karen nodded solemnly beside him, the picture of a wronged public servant. When it was Angela's turn to speak, her approach was methodical and devastating. Your Honor, the plaintiff's complaint rests on 3 fundamental assertions: that the evidence against her was fabricated, that she was legitimately elected as HOA president, and that her enforcement of HOA regulations was appropriate and even-handed. We intend to disprove each assertion comprehensively. She proceeded to submit the authenticated security footage, the power company's technical report confirming deliberate cutting of the lines, and testimony from the independent experts who had verified the video's integrity. Karen whispered furiously to Collins as each piece of evidence was presented. Furthermore, Angela continued, the plaintiff's claim of legitimate authority is directly contradicted by the HOA's own bylaws, which require a minimum 60% participation rate in presidential elections. Documentation shows that Ms. Westfield's election had only 25% participation, rendering her presidency procedurally invalid from its inception. Judge Richardson's eyebrows raised slightly as she reviewed the bylaws and election records. Mr. Collins, how do you respond to this discrepancy? Collins stepped forward smoothly. Your Honor, the participation threshold is a guideline, not a requirement. Previous administrations had established a precedent of accepting lower participation rates during uncontested elections. Is that written anywhere in the bylaws or amendments? The judge asked. It is an operational precedent, Your Honor, not a codified one. Judge Richardson made a note before turning back to Angela. Please continue, Counselor. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours, with Collins objecting to virtually every piece of evidence, and Judge Richardson overruling him with increasing irritation. The turning point came when Angela presented the financial records showing misappropriation of HOA funds. Your Honor, these records demonstrate that the plaintiff diverted approximately $87,000 of community funds for unauthorized purposes, primarily benefiting her own property. This is not merely a breach of HOA regulations, but potentially criminal misuse of funds. Karen's face drained of color, and she grabbed Collins' arm urgently. He quickly requested a brief recess, which the judge granted. When court resumed 20 minutes later, Collins' tone had changed dramatically. Your Honor, in the interest of efficiency, we would like to amend our complaint to focus specifically on the defamation claims and remove the financial aspects from consideration. Judge Richardson studied him for a long moment. Mr. Collins, This court does not appreciate having its time wasted with shotgun litigation designed to intimidate rather than seek justice. I am inclined to dismiss this case entirely if you continue to shift your arguments whenever evidence becomes inconvenient. By the end of the hearing, Judge Richardson had dismissed 7 of the 9 claims in Corinne's lawsuit, allowing only the defamation and invasion of privacy claims to proceed to discovery. Even these were significantly narrowed in scope. "I will not allow this court to be used as a weapon of intimidation," she declared in her ruling. The defendant's actions appear to have been reasonable responses to legitimate concerns about governance and possible misconduct. As we left the courthouse, Corinne and her legal team rushed past reporters without comment. Our neighborhood group gathered on the steps, relief evident on every face. Angela was cautiously optimistic. "This is a significant victory, but not a complete one. The remaining claims could still drag on for months." She was right. Over the next 12 weeks, we endured depositions, document requests, and continuous legal maneuvering. Corinne refused all settlement discussions, insisting on her day in court despite her attorney's increasingly evident frustration with the case. When we finally reached trial, it lasted just 3 days. Corinne's testimony was a study in contradiction and evasion. When confronted with the security footage she claimed she had been